Okay people, listen up. So, MIDI generators. So, is it cheating or is it just some handy tools that can assist you in creating music? Now, to be perfectly honest, occasionally I have used MIDI generators in the past and I'll probably still use them every once in a while. But personally, typically I prefer creating music from start to finish without any interference of AI or MIDI generation tools whatsoever. That's just my personal preference. It's most fulfilling, it's most gratifying, period. However, having said that, a few days ago I came across a MIDI generation plugin that I think is a very interesting one. I think it's actually in between automated MIDI generation and manual MIDI generation. I'll explain in a moment. But anyway, this plugin is called Midigrid. It was released by ADSR Sounds just a few days ago, so it's brand new. So let's take a look at Midigrid. So this is the Midigrid. This is what it looks like. Now I have to say that this thing does not come with any sounds built in. You know, it can only assist you in creating some MIDI patterns. So you have to route it to a MIDI instrument first. Now, once the routing is all set up, the first thing to do would be to choose a scale. We can do that from right here. Now, as you can see, we have some options. So let's choose Dorian. And then down here you see some additional options. So first of all, here we can set a root note. So let's choose D3. That's okay. We can change the speed. We could change the note length. There are some swing options here. We can set the velocity and the velocity variation. Now, once that all is done, now it's time for some fun. Now, let me first say that I did create a little drum loop just for reference, and it sounds like this. Okay, now let's start populating the 8x8 grid. So as you can see to the left here, we have some tools. So we have a redirect, we have up, we have down, we have left and right, and a reset. Let's start with left, and let's put it here on this cell. And let's see what happens when I press play. Okay, so as you can see, the arrow starts moving in the direction that the arrow is pointing, obviously. And when it hits something, you know, it will produce a note corresponding to what you see up here or what you see to the right here. Now, as this arrow is moving horizontally, we have to look at this value, which is a D3. Now, if this was moving vertically, that would be a different story. So let's try that. Let's choose up and let's place it here. And as it is moving vertically, it should produce the value we see here, which is a D5. Okay, now let's try to make it a little bit more interesting. So let's add a downwards arrow over here. And now let's see what happens. Okay, well, clearly we're seeing that something else is happening on the grid, but still we're getting the same result. And that is because, you know, as these two collide, these two blocks, you know, they bounce back and they're hitting the sides at the same time, and they're both triggering a D5. That's why we're getting the same result. So let's remove this here and let's place it over here. And now let's see if this makes a little bit of a difference. So now they're still both producing a D5, but they're not hitting the sides at the same time. Okay, now let's move this arrow up one block, and now we have an unequal amount of blocks in between these two arrows. So that means that they will meet on the same block, and that will trigger something else. So let's see what happens. So whenever there's an unequal amount of blocks in between two meeting arrows, you know, they will redirect. So that makes it a little bit more interesting. Now, to spice things up even a little bit more, we can also force a redirect by using the redirect tool over here. So let's place a redirect here, and now let's check the result. So slowly it's becoming a little bit more complex. Now let's keep going. So let's place a right arrow over here. Let's go. Now, as you can hear, again, it's becoming more and more complex. It is a little bit of a hit and miss sometimes, but that also makes it pretty interesting. So we could keep going and going, but you get the idea. All right, now let's move on to another instrument. So I put another instance of Midigrid on a bass sound. So again, let's first set the scale to Dorian, and let's change the root note. Last time I set it to D3. Now let's set it to D1 because it's a bass. And let's mess around with this a little bit. Let's see. Let's put an arrow here. Let's listen. All right, let's try something else. Maybe over here. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, let's try one more. Down. And let's do here. So as you can hear, something pretty interesting is already emerging. Okay, now let's do one more instrument. So I have a pad sound over here. Already set the scale and the root note. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned is that not only is Midigrid capable of producing single notes, it can also create chords. Now, if you want a particular lane to produce a chord instead of a single note, you have to go to its value, so either up here or to the right here, depending on which lane you want to edit. So let's say, for example, we want to edit this vertical lane here. Then we have to go to its value here, which is now set to D5. Right-click it. And now you can see that we have some options. So by default, it is set to none, which comes down to a single note. But let's change it to minor, which will produce a minor chord. So let's test that. Let's place an arrow here. And now let's see the result. Okay, let's make that a little bit more interesting. So let's put a redirect over here. Let's go. Now, of course, you can use this plugin however you like, but probably the most practical application would be to use it as a source of inspiration and to use it as a starting point. Now, probably the best way to do that would be to first export the sequences as MIDI notes. Now, to do that, first over here, we can set the export length. Now, we can choose between 1 bar, 2 bars, 4 bars, 8 bars, or 16 bars. Okay, well, in this case, I'm going to go with 8 bars. And then over here, we can drag out the MIDI to our arrange window. Okay, we can open it up. And then over here, we can edit our MIDI however we like. Now, I understand that not everyone is a big fan of MIDI generators, but again, I think that this is a very interesting one, and to be perfectly honest, I actually had a lot of fun playing around with it. And that is first of all because of the way it operates, all the moving parts and the interactions between them, that allows it to create some potentially very complex and very interesting sequences. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I kind of consider this in between automated, so randomized MIDI generation and manual MIDI generation. And the reason I say that is that theoretically, so purely theoretically, you could calculate what will happen if you add a block to the grid. So nothing is hidden, there are no hidden features under the hood or something. So theoretically, it's not random. However, it can very quickly become much too complex for the human mind. I mean, maybe Rain Man could come a long way, but ultimately it becomes much too complex for the human mind to fully comprehend. So we approach it as random, but theoretically it's not random. And on top of that, we can make it as complex or as simple as we like. So that's why I say, it's somewhere in between randomized MIDI generation and manual MIDI generation. But anyway, I think it's a very, very interesting tool, very inspirational, and potentially a very useful tool to get you started if, for example, you're stuck. So that's it about Midigrid from ADSR Sounds. Now, if you want to check it out, I will leave a link in the description. Now, you can also download a 30-day trial version, so you can mess around with it for a month. And if you don't like it, you can just forget about it and forget I ever said anything about Midigrid. Anyway, go check it out and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.